the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. I'm your host, Cooper Cherry. As always, we are sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Today's guest is C. Derick Varn, host of Pop the Left podcast, Mortal Science podcast, poet, editor, teacher, is part of the Zero Book staff as well. Derick and I discussed pretty much 1968 and, kind of that general period of history, a number of different thinkers from Situationists, Deleuze, Derrida, etc. But just a great overall episode. Really enjoyed it. So here is C. Derick Varn. It's awesome to have you. So.
Yeah, it's just funny because I've taught government, but I've actually I've taken law classes, obviously, because I studied to be a lawyer at one point, but I've actually never taken a political science class in my life because I don't think the field should exist. So
yeah, that kind of makes sense. Yeah, I can go along with that. I think I haven't either. My background, I've got a BA in English and sociology, and then I got an MA in mass communication with new media being the focus. So I graduated in 2009.
Oh, okay. Well, back when they were still doing, I started off in mass communication and in anthropology, moved over to philosophy, but I just had a bunch of credits, so I compiled them together into an anthrophilo liberal studies degree, and
right.
Then I got a BA in English literature proper and a minor in creative writing, and then I have way too many other degrees, but none of them are actually related to what I talked to you guys about. Most of it's educational theory or poetry.
Yeah. So I think I got some exposure in one of my it might have even been in English. I think it was an English class that they discussed. They mentioned Derrida a little bit, and this was 2001. So I'm 37, just for reference.
You're 2 years younger than me.
So got a little intro to Derrida up there that way, and that kind of, I was like, what this, I was defensive whenever I heard, I didn't like it at first. But it got me interested. So I ended up reading this random kind of little survey booklet that was at the college. I don't even remember what the hell the title was, but it was it had kind of a survey of postmodernism, and it even included Richard Rorty. And then that really got my mind going, and I think I've been kind of hooked on postmodernism, post-structuralism ever since, and that's kind of where I'm coming from in terms of my, I guess, development into the left, because I grew up on a cattle ranch in Texas.
Oh, okay.
So no exposure to Marxism. I mean, my family would jokingly say, that's a communist plot, or that's a commie plot. That's the kind of milieu that I grew up in. And, my grandfather would be if there were protests going on, he'd be he'd be gritting his teeth. He'd be oh, they should shoot those damn protesters, or, you know what I mean?
I grew up in Georgia, so not my parents were more apolitical than even that. But, although my stepdad was a Ross Perot supporter, so, it's really all I remember. But they were Obama supporters too, so who knows? Kind of just the low information, aimless Chad voter.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of the same vibe. My uncle in particular was a big Ross Perot guy, and so I was 9 years old at that age. So I got a Ross Perot sticker and put that on my Trapper Keeper or something.
Yeah, those were the days. All right, so you're kind of from an anarchist milieu, and we're going to talk about the French late 60s and maybe the transition to post-structuralism and anarchism out of the French left. Because I think, the thing is, though, those two things aren't quite copacetic. There's a relationship,
certainly,
but a lot of the biggest post-structuralists were non-Marxist quasi-Maoist, which is a weird. Like if you look at Foucault's politics, for example, he retained a lot of like the Sartre and Althusserian
Right.
love of third world stuff and like supporting revolutions on a kind of Maoist bent, but they really wasn't actually that cohesive with his political writings at all. It actually,
Right.
I mean, it actually just sort of seems arbitrary.
Yeah, Foucault is probably why, I mean, honestly, that's sort of what got me into anarchism, I think, back then when I was kind of dipping my toes into post-structuralism, like in grad school, because I was really interested. There was like Chris Anderson, the editor of Wired magazine, he wrote The Long Tail. And in like one little like last sentence of one of the chapters, he said that Al-Qaeda was in the long tail of like state violence or political violence or something like that. And that I was like, holy shit, that's fucking brilliant. So I kind of took that and ran with that and looked into sort of how like the EZLN and I guess Al-Qaeda as well, like as case studies of kind of using, online media, message boards, etc., to kind of facilitate this form of resistance, whatever that may be. And I think at the time, like the biggest source that I could find that was directly addressing that topic was a Rand Corporation study. That was like the only, kind of serious literature that had been done on the topic at the time, and they called it net war.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it reminds me of when you get into like conflict studies, you have to read a lot of fairly right-wing stuff, even if you're not right-wing sympathetic. But so, fifth generation warfare analysis. I mean, literally John Dolan, aka under Gary Betcher, his paleocon alter ego. Although, the alter ego has long since broken down, and there's really no real difference in their opinions now. Like he doesn't bother really separating those out. But for a while, he was the only like person who was left adjacent. I mean, like Dolan's hard to pin down politically, but who really studied this stuff. And I coming out of paleoconservatism, knew a lot of this stuff, and also knew a lot of leaderless resistance. One of the things I will say about leaderless resistance, though, and one of the problems with it, and this is not a critique of anarchism, it's just it is more effective as a terror tactic than it is as a way to organize anything, even decentralizedly.
And I mean, don't pull punches in terms of anarchism. I think that's fine. Like I don't take it personally or anything like that. That's kind of loosely, I think, where I'm at. But I have a bunch of different weird influences. I think right now I've been obsessed with psychoanalysis for the last probably like 2 years or so. And so I really, what I enjoy the most, what gets me excited in terms of theory or thought or what have you is like this kind of melding of semiotics, political economy, and psychoanalysis. Sort of how those interact and like that kind of, I don't know, I've heard it called like a libidinal materialism.
Yeah.
Something like
makes
that.
Sense. To me, it's something like postmodernism. Like, none of those terms are really anything, like they're such moving signifiers, right? But when you look at how anarchist thought has developed, I mean, one of the things about anarchist thought, we can get into that for a second, is in America, it's actually kind of in bad shape, even though there's still a fair amount of anarchists. I think the, Albert Graeber, to some degree, Chomsky-style anarchism, the Albert and Graeber style was so into this kind of performative occupation space that when Occupy got stalled, it seemed to have lost like a decade's worth of momentum, and then people just flooded into Marxist movements, and so that was interesting. And then you have like the Chomsky wing, but the Chomsky wing is so close to social democracy anyway, particularly now.
Exactly. Right.
That it's borderline indistinguishable. A lot of the anarchists I know and work with, they don't really have a theoretical background, and because of that, and I don't even actually say this as like an insult, they seem to be a kind of like the progressive end of liberalism on steroids.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like I can kind of see that, and I mean sometimes I feel like maybe that's where I am sort of. I'm trying to interrogate that, I think, within myself, but I don't know. I feel like I'm maybe there are some vestiges of that kind of liberal stuff, but I don't know. I think that's kind of waning, at least, hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, your listeners would have a hard time placing me, but I'll put myself on the Marxist spectrum. I am on the center right end of the left communist tradition, which is going to confuse people.
Right?
But,
Yeah,
like,
very much.
but I'm somewhere between. I sometimes call myself a post-Leninist. Like, I don't really believe in like vanguard formations. I actually do think the state is inherently classed in a way that if you don't abolish the state, and actually I tend to follow the, there's this scholar of Marxism, Derick Varn, who pointed out if you take the critique of the Goethe program as a plan and not just an imminent critique, and this will take me an hour to explain to you, but just if you take it as what Marx actually believed and not just him using the Lassallean socialist framework and critiquing it, you realize that even under Marx's criterion, that the state withers away really, really early. And so in Lenin's conception of it, the state withers away towards the very end, right? So it's one of the last things to fall away. It's pretty clear if you're reading the critique of the Goethe program, where he actually, the only time he states this out in a stage theory, that somewhere like the state's going to be gone before even you've gone from socialism to communism. Like, it'll be pretty early on, because Marx thought that states are necessarily classed. Like, they are classed by their nature. There's no way out of that. And if you have a state, a worker state, all you've done is change the ruling class of that state. Right. You have not actually devolved it. And when we get to because you told me you wanted to talk about the relationship between post-socialism and anarchism in France, and listening to your entrance, I get why you're Team France. I'm more Team Germany myself.
Are you a Hegelian?
No, actually.
Not really? Oh, interesting. Okay.
I'm a post-Hegelian in the sense that, like, I take stuff like Brandom very seriously and I take Marx very seriously, but I do not think Marx is just a simple Hegelian. Right. And I also think there's a lot of mystical thought in Hegelianism that gets formalized away when translated into English.
I agree. So that's one of my biggest bones to pick with Hegel. Is it sounds so much like, I grew up in a kind of fundamentalist Christian, like Southern Baptist sort of milieu, and so a lot of it feels very much in that same direction. So I have this like knee-jerk reaction against it.
Well, I mean, like when I read like the weird Swabian dialect of German that Hegel's writing in, and Hegel's one of the few German philosophers I can say reading him in German doesn't necessarily make him easier. In fact, what it did to me is but it did make me realize something, that every word Hegel selected had both a secular and religious meaning. Every single one. And depending on how it's translated, you can play up one side or the other. But like when you say like world spirit and absolute, those ideas are clearly related to theology. Yeah. And there's also some late medieval Hermetic stuff that's going into the way he's framing, the way he's recasting Kantian dialectics.
Right. Okay.
And I think that's pretty unassailable, although modern Hegelians just kind of laugh at me when I bring this up. But I'm like, if you do the research, the secularization of Hegelian thought actually was like a Prussian university project. It was kind of a deliberate mission of the quote unquote early scientific university of Prussia under Bismarck. And so like there was a movement in Germany to do this too. And it wasn't just the left Hegelians, like the right Hegelians also wanted a more scientific Hegelian framework, even though they were also retaining separately from that, like the theology, the commitment to Lutheranism. I mean, Hegel says he was an Orthodox Lutheran. I think he was probably actually, formally speaking, a heretic, but like it's still, it reads like religious stuff. And I think one of the things that fascinates me, but also is like maddening about structuralism, like structural psychoanalysis, like Lacan. One is between you and me and all your listeners, I guess. I think Lacan's maybe full shit, but
that's my hero too. So, but let me go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, even if Lacan was full of shit, he was so committed. Like his like the whole thing. You still, even if he was just grifting, that's one hell of a grift. You know what I mean?
I mean, I don't think he was grifting. I think what he was trying to do was work out some of the thick description of psychoanalysis in an even more abstract way, partly because of the influence of a specific kind of Hegelianism on him. I think that mostly goes back to Kojève.
Right.
And, like, I don't know. I tend to like Bataille and the weird occultic, almost Stalinist, but not quite. Like, it's just like also Nietzschean, obsessed with human, crazy person,
right?
Who was, Lacan stole his wife too. So, but I think that's an interesting sort of heritage that shows up in the French stuff. And what's interesting about the French critical theory, particularly, is that it goes in so many crazy directions at once. I mean, that's where post-structuralism really comes in.
Right.
But even like before that, when you're still dealing with like structuralism and existentialism, when you think about existentialism, somehow you have people who combined Heideggerian assumptions about being with absolute free will, almost Ayn Randian levels of free will, and became leftist, and of particular leftist, dissident Maoist. That's a little nutty when you actually try to like draw the line. And so there was this fecundity in France in the 60s. And part of it had to do with the fact, part of what I study actually related to my job is the structure of educational institutions. I'm just a teacher these days, but I've studied a lot of this stuff very, very formally. And if you read a book by David Blacker, it's called The Falling Rate of Learning. He goes into this in detail. But in France and Western Europe in general, it wasn't so much in Germany because of things having to do with fixing after the war, but definitely in the countries that were not quite as, on the front lines as far as like the Cold War goes.
Right. You
had full employment, but part of how full employment was maintained, or pretty close, it was like 2% unemployment or something, it was extending education out. And that had been seen, as a that had been done in America as a side effect of the GI Bill, and it was picked up in there too. One of the things that led to 68 was just, was students and workers collaborating, because there was like, you went up to like 4 or 5% unemployment, which after the 80s in most of the West is normalized. Like, it seems so low, but that's what was going on. And I think what that led to, ironically, is you had a lot of people who would have been outside of academia priorly. Right. And for good and ill, this led to a lot of, I mean, you even think about like a lot of the personalities of people who we know of from this time period, say even before post-structuralism, back in highly structuralism. But like Camus is not someone that would have normally been afforded that kind of education. So the educational expansion had created this like large French literary and philosophical culture, basically to keep people studying, I mean, even in the technical sense, and studying in a way that kept them out of the workplace. During the same time period, because the business cycle, while it was still in place, it was not nearly as erratic as it was supposed to be under Marxist critique as understood by sort of orthodox Marxism. So when I put myself on the Marxist spectrum, for example, I said I was like the center right of the left communism, which is some people would say is to the left the most anarchist. Like, we talk about the abolition of the value form altogether, and I just like, well, occasionally you have to interact with states. Like,
I have some left com sympathies. I mean, I'm not.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of where I think some of it,
like anything like libertarian socialism, situationist kind of elements, whatever in that kind of ball of anarchism and left.
Well, I mean, and after 68, what happens in leftism, and I mean, we're jumping ahead of a period here, but like you have a resurgence of anarchism, a resurgence of left communism. I think a lot of the later postmodernists and post-structuralists, frankly, it was not a reactionary turn, but it was a turn that was dealing with a kind of conservatism when none of these things could deliver what they promised. Right. And so you had a cynicism kind of sneak into the analysis that was natural. And I mean, I hate to say it, but kind of necessary, even if I think some of it is Baudrillard's search for authenticity is almost reactionary, but so I think that's what is partly coming out of here. But I think also from a structural awareness, when you read something like The Beach Beneath the Streets, which is a great thing about these ideas, like situationalist.
Such a great book. Thank you for that recommendation. That was a lot of fun. So I should also mention, like, going back to Hegel and like thinkers that are currently working with Hegel. So I'm recording this evening with Reza Negrostrani about his book Intelligence and Spirit. So That'll be interesting.
So when you look at that thing, what happened there in my mind is you had a bunch of things a bunch of crises that kind of hit at once. You had this slight tick back in employment, and this new sort of Gaullist, Fordist thing that they had going on was beginning to slow down. You had anger over French colonialism in Northern Africa, legitimately. You had the humanization of the former Stalinist bureaucracy. And what was interesting about that, all right, is deStalinization would have made, and humanism would have made formal French communism more palatable to a lot of people. But it actually kind of did the opposite, because they had to explain why the business cycle wasn't going the way it was supposed to go. And they took these pro-bourgeois development stances that were actually very similar to the social democratic stances in the 19-teens and 20s. And so this alienated a lot of like young workers who were also like, well, why are you supporting colonialism? Like, why are you? But the formal French parties, I mean, you know, stood against it. Lacan was stood against it, actually. And after that, you had the situationalists who were mostly left communist. Some of the situationalists were pretty much anarchists, but most of them were a kind of left communist. There were also French versions of Bordiga's current. So Bordiga was the Italian left communist who was kind of removed. He was a leader of the PCI and actually stood up to Stalin in person, but was removed from the my Italian pronunciation is often bad, but Togliatti, the leader of the PCI after Gramsci, kind of accused him of being a fascist collaborator and erased his history in the party. During this time period, he retreated from politics for the most part, but did kind of form what he considered a remnant organization of left communists in Italy, and they had a lot of influence in France too. So after 1968, those groups developed actually into one of the first strains of primitivism, which is interesting and also a little bit strange. Like if you know Jacques Camat.
I'm not familiar.
Jacques Camat, who wrote Against Civilization, had came to the conclusion after 1968 that capitalism had become overly decadent and stagnated, but was no longer a subject to the business cycle, and the only way out of its controlling apparatuses was to opt out entirely. And by opt out entirely, we don't mean tune in and drop out. I mean go to the woods and give up on all technology.
Like rewilding and shit like that.
Yeah, that's where that comes from. So weirdly, even though that's associated with anarchists, it comes out of a kind of left communist trend. I mean, in America, oddly, it doesn't have quite the same history. It actually comes out of a weird kind of absolutist reading of Adorno, but in France, it comes out of these left communist movements. They sort of don't go into the academy. And then who remains in the academy is like these post-structuralists who start doubting the narrative of Marxism. Like that becomes, but they don't totally drop its politics, they drop its framework. You know, Foucault retains a lot of Althusser there. I mean, like, and Althusser is probably one of my least favorite Marxists as a side note, but like Foucault does some interesting things with it. I think Foucault does more with Althusser than Althusser does. But all the Marxism starts getting bracketed out and removed.
Yeah.
The existentialists sort of, they kind of seem like the establishment radicalism. They kind of side first with the Khrushchevites, then with sort of official Maoism, not the most radical ends of Maoism. So they start losing influence. And also people start realizing that their critiques of like dialectics meant that they weren't really Marxist either. I mean, like in a sense that like existential, like if you read the Critique of Dialectical Reasoning or whatever, like they've actually taken out a lot of the core, you know, conceptions of Marxist logic out of the equation. So of course, to me, you could develop it in different directions at this point. What's interesting also about French theory, though, is French theory becomes more popular in the late 70s and 80s in America than it actually even really is in France. It also has a lot of influence through psychoanalysis in Latin America. So like Lacanian psychoanalysis gets a lot of that work gets taken up in left-wing circles in Latin America. But so those trends together seem to indicate that you kind of have a breakdown, because there's a whole lot of things that Marxism should have predicted. And to be fair to Marxism, if you'd have done a proper Marxist analysis without being tied to like political ramifications and states that actually existed at the time, you probably could have figured a lot of this stuff out and handled it. But because they were they were having to pick sides in these geopolitical wars that were very, very not abstract.
Yeah.
they weren't flexible enough to deal with conditions as they actually were on the ground. They couldn't change their class analysis. They were always seeming to just kind of adjust things ad hoc. And that really discredited Marxism in France. And you had this just flurry of different weirdo sects. I mean, communization theory comes out of this time period. Its first instantiations are in France. Primitivism comes out of this time period. Kind of post-situationism, postmodernism in the Leotardian sense, in the Baudrillardian sense, which I do see as slightly conservative. Post-structuralism emerges out of this. So you just have this fecundity of like people dealing with the fact that people forget that the initial skepticism of post-structuralism was not just based on a skepticism about narratives in the abstract. It was also based on the fact that so many narratives have fallen down for contingent reasons that were not accounted for. And thus, people started digging for new ways of dealing with that contingency. Right. That's definitely what was going on with Althusser, and he's a structuralist. But like his focus on like Spinozian physics or whatever, and going into a very weird place to try to re-scientify Marxism. But like that's coming out of a sense that like the official party lines of this time period have been just utterly wrong. And it also looks like that even the radical, communists who were sort of loyal oppositionists to the Gaullist state. I mean, they were quasi-loyal. They have been part of the coalition of resistance, so there was a history there, but they were also diametrically opposed. They were also seen as just becoming too soft on official French society. And so this led to just a proliferation of ideas, but those ideas get dropped. What's interesting that I think is not studied a lot in America, but is studied a lot in France, is these do like get dropped in, like French philosophy actually becomes fairly conservative in the late 70s, early 80s with a different set of philosophers than is commonly studied in English. In English, we tend to study like the high period of post-structuralism, and we kind of end there. And I mean, like, we forget that, like, for example, Derrida left France for a very long time. I mean, like, yeah, he didn't necessarily, he went back to France, obviously, and started philosophical programs there later. But, like, if you look at his legacy, I mean, some of it was explicitly brought over to America with him here. I mean, I think, was it Princeton he went to?
I can't remember. I know he was.
I used to know a lot of this better. I've been asked to talk about Derrida.
It was like UC Santa Cruz eventually, but I can't remember.
Yeah.
I think the first, like, whatever that 65 or something, whenever he kind of had that, there was a symposium or something at Harvard where he kind of launched deconstruction as structuralism is kind of like coming to America.
It was 67, I believe, is when that really happened. And what's interesting is that, like, that means it's coming to America almost contemporaneous with it happening in France too. Right. I mean, like, he gets brought. He taught at two different schools in the United States during like the 80s and 90s, and I can't remember which two. He's also still working in France. What's interesting to me about Derrida, though, I mean, like, is I can't, obviously you were talking about how I used to teach about him, and it's funny to me, I went to school just a little bit before you did in the aughts, and Derrida was all over the place. And, like, if you go to programs now, it's like it's been erased. I mean, it's strange. Like, if you look at, like, Compt's reading list for PhDs in critical theory in English, I mean, I'm sure he's still there, but you'll see a lot more, like, Badiou, Deleuze. And so, like, I haven't really quite understood why.
Yeah, he's sort of fallen out of favor to some degree.
Like, why Derrida has fallen, like, Derridian deconstruction has fallen out of favor, but Deleuzianism hasn't.
Yeah.
It's not like Deleuze is, like, a whole lot easier to read. I mean, I do often feel like once you get out of the, like, linguistic terrorism of what Derrida is doing by enacting the philosophy upon you, and you realize, like, oh, this book was, like, once I realized that he's just enacting it on me through this book, I could probably understand this in a paragraph. But the process of him enacting it on you through the way he's writing is part of the point.
Right.
So the thing is, though, what do you make of Derrida's? Really, I mean, have you read Spectres of Marx?
I have not. That's like the big one that haven't gotten around to. I have basically, like, my reading list is driven almost entirely by the podcast.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's like I'm like cramming every week. I'm like this week I was reading like 2 books. And my week was at work was a nightmare too. So I'm like falling asleep with like 2 books in my hands, like. But I'm definitely interested to read it. Particularly, I think he mentioned Stirner, who I'm also kind of a fan of as well to some degree.
Yeah, Stirner, the most radical of radical Hegelians, who, like, starts, like, casting doubts on anything. my favorite Stirner joke is a spook is a spook.
Yeah, right. Yeah. That's a good
But
one.
yeah, so Derrida is interesting though, because it's hard for me to know. One of the things that has harmed deconstruction, I do think, is not so much Derrida, but in Paul de Man and in Heidegger, like their overlap with fascism is problematic. And Derrida did seem to be somewhat blind to it.
It's interesting given his background, because I'm 99% sure he was Algerian.
Yeah, he was.
And was never really, I don't think he ever was a member of any like official communist parties, or even though I think he had, leftist sympathies, I don't think he was ever even a member, versus like Foucault was definitely a member for a time.
Right.
I don't know about Deleuze. Guattari was a trot for a while.
Right. So no, I think he's like maybe like Paul Ricoeur, who's another one who just wasn't really, they were political, but not political.
Yeah.
I mean, Derrida got recommendations of interestingly, when you look at his career, he is actually promoted by Marxists, like Jean Hoplite and Althusser are the people who got him his job as a support. But like he was never actually a Marxist. I think that comes up in Spectres of Marx too, although he does think that Marx's contribution is super important.
Yeah.
But what's interesting to me is he also wasn't like he was definitely associated with the left, but a lot of his disciples weren't. And so trying to parse his politics is actually quite difficult. Was he kind of an anarchist? Was he kind of a radical left liberal? Like, it's really hard to know. He does seem to have largely cosmopolitan sympathies. And so, that's really hard to square with any kind of fascist project. But like I said, the demands sketchy history, and then like, particularly now that we know, I mean, we've always kind of known about Heidegger, like, I mean, like if you didn't know that, I mean, but particularly now that the Black Book has been translated, it's really hard to deny. But it is interesting, his relation to the left seems more nebulous. And in a way, maybe that's another thing that has caused that particular brand deconstructive into post-structuralism to kind of fall out of favor, because it, even when it is not, associated with sketch, it never seems politically like devoted. And like some of, like when you also look at like Derrida's fans in the United States and his big boosters in English philosophy, most of them were fairly bourgeois liberally. So it's hard to parse one of the things I think it may be unfairly thrown at a lot of the post-structuralists. I mean, one is, for example, Foucault was of the left, although towards the end of his life, he was deliberately flirting with neoliberal ideas. That's not just undeniable. Like when we finally started getting the lectures translated, that it was, people started like noticing that. Would he have gone in a right-wing direction? I don't know. I kind of tend not to think so, but I also think people forget how restrictive a lot of official like social democratic parties and stuff felt, because they also basically embrace Fordism and social control. And so a lot of like early social democracies, like liberational promise, was just not delivered on at all. Yeah. And so one of the things that I'm trying to come up with a coherent theory on this about why certain political tendencies come up when they do. Yeah. Like why right now, for example, in the United States, are both forms of predominant leftism somewhat national sympathetic, even if they're anti-American. So what do I mean by that? So what we've seen is a resurgence of MLs online, and in some I see them in the real world too, actually. But they are like hyper marginal. They're like 0.2% of the population or something. Right. But the fact we see them at all as a stream is kind of new. Like when I used to meet Stalin apologists in the aughts, they were almost all fascists. You didn't meet a lot of left-wing Stalin apologists. You would meet Nosballs. Those people I hardly ever meet now. People get accused of it all the time, but those projects tend to be okay with what I'll be honest, I think is bourgeois nation states, just not the U.S. So bourgeois nation states on the quote unquote periphery of capital. Although honestly, saying China is on even the semi periphery of capitalism is kind of funny, right? Because it's the second producer, has more billionaires in the United States. The Gini coefficient's actually higher than the U.S. It is a more unequal society, but it has reduced a lot of poverty. So you have those guys, And also weirdly, like the China Stanism, like when I met Maoist 10, 15 years ago, they opposed the current Chinese state. That's less and less true, which is also strange because like the Chinese state hasn't socialized a whole lot more. Then it's become more nationalist. Conversely, do you know about the Angela Nagel scandals and whatnot?
Yeah. A little bit. I paid some attention. Yeah. What? Yeah. I knew.
Yeah, I worked for Cedar Book, so obviously, I actually don't think all of Angela's work even now is bad. But there is one of the things one of the reasons why I think she gets canceled so much is she says some things that are implied in social democracy out loud.
Yeah.
And it freaks people out. But it also is implied in social democracy. Like if you think you can run socialism off of a tax base.
Yeah.
You need profits to do that. And if also you have to know who's in the country to allocate resources from a tax. So completely open borders don't work for that.
Yeah.
Now, I'm an internationalist communist. I don't think that's viable. I think eventually profits will go too low. You can't do that in the long run anyway. Like social democracy will always get into a bind that it can't get out of. But the bind is implied. So one of the things I've been trying to figure out, like what is different now than say in 68, where we see this resurgence of like two different kinds of basically opposing nationalist friendly internationalism. Like all these people are internationalists in some sense.
Yeah.
But they are much more cozy with the nation state than even like Trotskyists were, 10, 15 years ago. And definitely then like libertarian socialists or left communists or anarcho-syndicalists, the communist, the communist adjacent ends of anarchism, which were way more dominant 10 years ago than they are now. I am trying to figure out what structural changes promotes these things and makes them fall in and out. And so looking at 68, when this stuff really emerges for the first time, and you see both the emergence of strong anti-revisionism too, like that also comes out at the same time. So you have people doubling down on Stalinism in response to this as well. But what cycles prompt that? One of the things does seem to be related to where you are in a business cycle, and also like how much of the population is highly educated but maybe underemployed. So that's something I think studying 68 is important to understand. I also
what about that parallel now? Because I think you have with the explosion of student loans, right? So that's creating, I think, a very similar ground.
It's actually a much more volatile ground if you think about it. It's just we're falling from you're falling from full employment, relative job stability, the boom of post-war buildup, creating a lot of temporary jobs. But it seemed like maybe the business cycle had been bought off. No, in retrospect, it was actually just the effects of large insertions of cash from an imperialist project, to Western Europe. That also there was a lot of things that needed to be rebuilt, so that you had stuff for people to do.
Right.
In the United States, you had a lot of market capture because you were the largest man standing and didn't lose your productive capacity, and so there was just an illusion of abundance. Now you have, ironically, when profits decline, believe it or not, people tend to hoard wealth way more and get richer and richer and richer, and we're seeing that.
Yeah.
And what do I mean by profits declining? Commodity profits and profits on physical commodities have dropped pretty significantly. I mean, like, look at food. Why do we need immigrant labor for food? It's because the profit margins that are so low. That's true for almost all physical commodities. We've moved into kind of a rentier economy now, which is also something that's confusing. Like Marxists don't entirely know how to process that because they're focused primarily on commodities. And the rentier economy is dependent on the commodity economy, but it can generate a whole lot of what in Marxism we might call fictitious capital, what you just might call balance sheet capital if you're just doing, a profit and loss report. And so we're seeing a lot of centralization like that. So right now we're kind of seeing the same thing, but on a different end of it. If you, a non-Marxist theorist is actually useful for this. He's not an anarchist either. He's just he's a historical theorist, Peter Turchin, the most structuralist person in the world. I was going to warn you that there's lots of equations, lots of historical comparisons, analogies from history, stuff that would make Foucault like his teeth will chatter if he was still alive. But he draws out how we're on a very similar secular cycle, but we're actually on a downturn, and that was the upturn of it. So what you saw there was the end of the first upturn. And what we're seeing now is a massive downturn where we've had three jobless recovery business cycles. We've dealt with that by expanding education, which ironically means we have more and more people educated to go into elite positions, but less and less elite positions for them to go into.
Like myself, right?
Right.
You know what I mean? It's like I'm like 37 with an advanced degree, and I'm doing an entry level customer service job, right?
Right. So like, I've been a professor and now I'm a high school teacher. Like it's just stuff like that. You're going to see a lot more of that. That actually destabilizes society. So I think we might have another period of rapid ideological fecundity, but we also might have stagnation. Like if you look at these cycles on long durée terms, like it can go in either direction. One of the two things happen. I'm hoping that the pressure leads to. So one of the ironies of having all these, elites now thrown back on elites, and I'm using elites here. We're not elites. Like a lot of us come out of the working class. Finally, are the first people allowed into the education for these jobs, but we can't get them. So we go back, but now we have the education of someone who would have been. We're not necessarily as skilled for a variety of reasons. We go into that later, but so we're going to take these ideas out. So one of the things that you have seen that you didn't see, like in the 90s when you had these fights, they were largely academic. Now I hear high schoolers using these kind of terms. They don't really understand them. Yeah. They don't know where they come from, but they're now, because we are out in the general culture and not just hiding out in ivory towers. These ideas are too.
Oh, for sure. Theory online. I mean, I'm pretty active on Twitter, and I mean, high school kids are reading Deleuze, and it's crazy, like the explosion of theory. And I mean, MLs too. I think like probably kids that are, maybe 5 or 6 years younger than me, I think is where you see that transition to maybe it's Occupy that kind of generates that. Because like when I was in college, I mean, I went to Texas State, like in the heart of Texas, right? So that's pretty, even sociology, we barely looked at Marx, and it was sort of an afterthought.
Yeah. The college I got to, they booed Greg Palast. No, they booed Patch Adams off stage for mentioning a Greg Palast book in 2001. So like the idea of like the hyper liberal college campus was not something that I knew, even though like we were a liberal arts school. So, and our faculty I don't think there weren't many out communists, but there were like Zapatista, adjacent people. And
I had no radical teachers that would talk about Marx or communism or anything, anarchism even at all.
I knew the only Marxist I knew in the anti-war movement, and they were International Answer, and where I was at, and I'm not going to name names because what I'm about to say is mean. They were so embarrassing and so naive on foreign politics that it actually pushed me towards the anti-war right, which is how I got involved in paleoconservative for about 3 years. It was because like I was an anti-war person. I was actually kind of a low-key anarchist, but I also didn't trust corporations, and so I didn't really know what to do with that because I couldn't really become like a libertarian.
Right.
And before I realized, because I have I have a partial Jewish background, so like before I realized that Pat Buchanan was kind of a closet anti-Semite, like it sounded pretty good because they were opposing all these wars that I also opposed.
Right.
And back then they'd also like people forget like at the Battle for Seattle, Pat Buchanan was there. It was like just how like Alex Jones was still like trying to be sympathetic to leftists back in the Occupy days. It was there's this very weird milieu. That milieu seems dead now. I mean,
there's a very distinct dividing line.
Yeah. I mean, like, and there's no, even libertarians don't even really talk to left-wing anarchists the way they used to. So, yeah, post-structuralism, I kind of want to see a revival of it, but I don't know where it's going to go. I mean, if you want to pivot towards that, because, like, I'm very, as you can tell, I was talking to you, I'm very systems thinking in my thought.
Yeah.
But I do think post-structuralism was very good at keeping us honest, because there are times where this idea that somehow we're doing something like Isaac Asimov's psychohistory and like we can just predict everything. One, Marxists have a shit track record of that on their own. Like other than predicting crises, which like since we figured out the business cycle first. But like other than that,
I actually wanted to ask you about that with Trotskyites with their Trotsky's predictions. All the negative ones sort of coming true, but none of the
positive ones.
Yeah. I just read that book. Have you seen the Posadas book?
Oh, the one by Adam Gimlitz
Yeah,
of
yeah.
Antifada. Yeah.
I just read
I've
that a
seen it
couple of weeks
because
ago, so it's kind of
because
fresh in my mind.
actually, it's a funny story. They emailed me the same day you did.
That's funny.
And so, because I know a lot about Latin American Marxism, but not Argentinian Marxism, I know a lot more about Peru and Mexico, where I used to live.
Gotcha.
So,
Peru, like Shining Path,
yeah.
Gonzalo-ite kind of stuff.
I used to date. This is funny, but I used to date a woman who was a descendant of someone. A couple members of her family were in Shining Path, and then turned against it later. And so she would have very interesting things to tell me. And then when she would meet people like Marxists, and she's from LA, like Marxists who younger people, she's slightly younger than us, but still in her mid 30s, and she would meet like these late 20 somethings who get obsessed with Shining Path and like radical circle, and she would laugh at them like to their face. And she was not an anti-Marxist, or anti-communist. It wasn't any of that, but she was just like, no, that's not, you don't know what happened.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I know a lot from her, and then doing my own studies because of her. I know a lot about Peru, and from living in Mexico and interacting with a lot of stuff in Oaxaca, particularly after those students disappeared, because that was when I was there. I know a fair amount about Mexican Marxist movements as well as their other indigenous, syndicalist movements and stuff like that. I mean, like Mexican syndicalism and the sort of borderlines between left communism and anarchism in Mexico are actually super important, because their revolution happened the same time as the Russian one. It obviously went a different way, but the thought leaders were different. There were different kinds of anarchists more than, because in Mexico, a lot of Marxism hadn't really gotten all that distilled there yet. And there were, what's Flores? The two brothers. I know so much about these guys, and their name just left me. They're two of the anarcho-syndicalist brothers came to some similar conclusions as some of the early Marxists did on their own, with some influence from Marx, but it's unclear how much, because it's not clear what was all even available in Mexico at the time, as far as I know. And so those traditions are very interesting. I mean, you had the Zapatistas who can have some ideological trace all the way back to Zapata. You have sort of like the quasi-bourgeois northern socialism, Pancho Villa, and his hope for a Norteño state, which included what would be parts of the United States now. That stuff is also very interesting and influential there. So, I studied a lot of that. But yeah, so yeah, sorry, I went on a tangent. I'm bad about that.
That's
so
good. I
we're
like
talking
those
about
detours.
Adam
I think that's fun.
We're
But I was
talking
asking
about
about Trotsky and the predictions.
the predictions in the transitional program, which are okay. So they all have happened, but Trotsky, well, not all of them. Most of the negative positions have happened. Although, if you read about them happening when he said they were going to happen, because he predicted they were going to happen in the 50s,
Right? Yeah.
it is hilariously wrong. And Trots avoid talking about the predictions he makes in the beginning of that program. There's another thing. If you ever read Mac McNair, he's a neo-Kautskyist. Neo-Kautskyist critic of Lenin. Is still kind of Lenin friendly. He's in the CPGB PCI. So many communist parties of Great Britain, you have to say all the after initials. But he's not, and he did this engagement with all these Trot groups, and he said, the Marcyites and the Spartacists were the closest to right, but when you actually mapped up all the Trot sectarian predictions about the Soviet Union and how it was going to fall and what was going to happen, none of them were actually correct. And what the effects were, either they didn't predict the fall correctly, or if they did, they didn't predict the outcome correctly. And he has said that Trots get away because of their dissident position on Stalinism, and particularly for a while they looked vindicated by the fall of the Soviet Union. But people didn't really study that their predictions weren't all that accurate. And particularly in the 70s, when they got frustrated in Latin America, things got weird. Another thing in English-speaking world, when you look at Trotskyism, you can find a Trot equivalent to anything thing you can find in the rest of Marxism. There's Trotskyists who oppose identity politics. There's Trotskyists who support it. Sometimes the same tendency will flip radically on a dime. The ISO was known for doing that. There are how they stood on America's role in imperialist wars varied dramatically depending on the tendency. How even they feel about unions varied dramatically depending on it. I mean, like the Northites, the people who run the World Socialist website, are anti-union. It's there's some, Lenin was known for critiquing trade union consciousness and all that, but he was not against unions existing. So it was those tendencies. I guess what I'm saying is, like, when you see a supposedly ideological tendency break down to where it mirrors something on everything else, like, so you can no longer tell what it's unique, that shows you that people are not coping with either some predictions were wrong or what have you. I mean, another thing, if we're completely honest about Trotskyism, is a lot of what Trotsky critiques Stalin for, right before his death, he also advocated. And a lot of the better policy in the Soviet Union, that kept Stalin somewhat in check, came from Bukharin, who Trotsky thought was more dangerous to him than Stalin was, which was insane, objectively insane. So that also actually stopped the two people who were, like, if you look at the history of fascism and the Marxist response to this, and this is also something that leads to like an anarchist resurgence, is like how bad Marxists miscast fascism. The right opposition and the Trotskyists both kind of recognized fascism for what it was in a way that, third period Stalinism did not. And for your listeners who don't know all this Marxist jargon, third period Stalinism was the period before the breach of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where the Stalinists had decided that social democrats were social fascist, and so siding with actual fascists was not going to be any different than working with capitalists. Therefore, you can make tactical agreements with them, even to suppress, people who were arguably closer to you, but who you think are really just fascists anyway. The social democrats don't think that they can outmaneuver fascism, and the only people who are really kind of right about it, and neither one of them are completely right about it, are the left and the right oppositionists, which are Bukharin's people. And then the left oppositionists, which are Trotsky's people. But those two groups hate each other so much they can't come together to do anything, so they kind of both get liquidated. I mean, so of course anarchism would look pretty good after that. Also the most obvious thing, because the one anarchist, the one socialist who was anarchist friendly, he wasn't an anarchist, but he was anarchist friendly. He was also CIA friendly, sadly, that we know about is that we read in high school is George Orwell. And he documents pretty well what happens in the Spanish Civil War. And so, and the anarchists look pretty good in that too, because the Stalinists are literally, we're fighting fascists, but we're also shooting anarchist factions and liberal factions in a way that makes it easier for the fascists to win. So whose side are we really on? And that led to a massive, a lot of people just became Cold War liberals, but a lot of people moved into anarchism. And I think France was weirdly outside of all that until the 68. So that's the long and the short of it. Yeah, I mean, we've gone all over everywhere. You want to ask me some distilled questions instead of letting me ramble on about history?
Oh no, your rants are good. I was just going to say one of the things you mentioned a while back was that that sort of rightward turn. I think you mentioned in kind of like the late 70s, 80s.
Yeah.
So on that string, I have heard that even Nick Land sort of bemoaned Deleuze and Guattari's rightward turn from Anti-Oedipus to A Thousand Plateaus.
Right.
Which I think is the irony and the hilarity of that now is so interesting.
When you read Fang Noumena, have you read Fang Noumena?
I've read a couple of the essays from it.
Read it in chronological order. It's amazing how perceptive he is, but it's also, once you get towards the end, the weird Austrian Cthulhu, Austrian economics plus Chinese authoritarian plus Cthulhu beast love that you get in post-Fang Noumena Nick Land in his right-wing accelerationism. It's not surprising. It's not a surprise. He thinks there's a bigger shift than I think there is. I think all it took was, Shanghai and a lot of drugs to finally push the natural tendency, the right-wing tendencies of that thought out to what it is. But yeah, I mean, I think if you look like Michael DeLanda, there's a right-wing turn. I also think there's an institutional turn. One of the things that I find frustrating about liberal Foucauldians is these people can agree that everything is basically an institutional prison, and then they go on to spend their lives building supposed better versions of those institutions. And it's did you read
Right.
this as a instruction manual, like. But there's so much of that in academia with these thinkers in particular. And I think that's because their project kind of got stalled out too. Deconstructionism's project doesn't seem inherently political.
Right. I mean, at an abstract level, I think, but
yeah,
that's like a 30,000 foot abstraction.
Right. I mean, it seems political in that it's a kind of anti-politic. Because if you don't believe in grand narratives at all, you want to deconstruct them almost all politics is some kind of narrative. The post-structuralists are a little better, but there does seem to be a right-wing move in a lot of their thought. And then in the 90s and early aughts, when you and I were in this, it just felt like we were arguing over arcana. Like the debates over about the death of the author or some were more dominant than any of the political implications in it. And
I think that's fair.
I think that's part of why there was a backlash against it by the late aughts. Not all post-structuralism, but definitely like deconstruction a lot of also like the weird post-structuralists, like kind of social democrats like Laclau, and then are like Habermas, taking Habermas taking a Frankfurt School critical theory into like the most liberal form possible. I mean, like, I get kind of why it stalled out. Do you think maybe at the end of this time, because I think this time period is going to look weird in about 10 years.
Yeah.
The birth of Mustache Man and Frog Twitter is gonna be like, what the hell were we all on?
I mean, Deleuze and Guattari are still very much. Maybe it's just the aesthetics of Twitter or online that.
No, Deleuze and Guattari
there's a certain libidinal. You know what I mean? There's kind of a flash and libidinal element that I think attracts a lot of people. But that Deleuze is super pop, at least in the circles that I'm frequenting. Maybe that's confirmation bias to a degree, but
Deleuze is super popular. When Zero Books did a Jordan Peterson thing, I was actually taking tick marks on how much Deleuze was referenced. Part of that, I think, is the nature of Deleuze, because Deleuze's work is deliberately not coherent. Like each work is almost a discrete set of tools, and applied metaphors and whatnot. And some of them are brilliant, and some of them I think are nuts. Like some of what they do metaphorically with like the MCM circuit and Marx, I'm like, but that doesn't apply to that, bro.